A millionaire evicts an elderly woman for not paying rent, and a young beggar shouts, "You have no heart." But when he steps inside the house, he immediately breaks down in tears at what he sees. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maxwell Bennett's polished mahogany desk as he reviewed the final demolition orders. His steel-gray eyes scanned the documents with practiced efficiency, barely registering the human implications behind each legal paragraph. The expansive office on the 35th floor offered a panoramic view of the city he'd helped shape over the past 2 decades, each gleaming tower a testament to his vision of progress. "Mr. Bennett, the team is assembled in the conference room," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, interrupting his thoughts. Maxwell straightened his Italian silk tie and gathered the documents. Today marked the final phase of the Highland Square project, his crowning achievement. The last obstacle was a dilapidated Victorian mansion sitting stubbornly in the middle of what would soon become San Francisco's most prestigious shopping district. The conference room buzzed with anticipation as Maxwell entered. Development. Plans covered the walls, showing rendered images of a magnificent glass and steel structure that would soon replace the old neighborhood. His business partner, Richard Sterling, stood at the head of the table, iPad in hand. "Max, glad you could join us." Richard's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "We were just reviewing the timeline for today's operation." Maxwell nodded curtly and took his seat. The project manager, Sarah Chen, began her presentation, but Maxwell's attention drifted to the window. From this height, he could just make out the old Victorian mansion, its weathered roof standing out among the modern buildings. Surrounding it, "The eviction team is ready." Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. "They're just waiting for your final approval." Maxwell turned back to the room, aware of all eyes on him. This was usually his favorite moment, the culmination of months of planning, the threshold of another victory. Yet something felt different today. "Mr. Bennett," Sarah prompted. "Proceed as planned," he said firmly, pushing down the unfamiliar twinge of doubt. Hours later, Maxwell stood at the edge of the crowd gathering around the old mansion. Security personnel formed a barrier between the protesters and the eviction team. Signs bobbed above the crowd, "Save our heritage" and "People over profit." The front door opened and Ellen Crawford emerged, supported by a social worker. The EC, elderly woman's silver hair caught the afternoon light, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. Maxwell had never met her in person, had only seen her name on legal documents, but something about her bearing made him shift uncomfortably. As Mrs. Crawford descended the worn steps, a commotion erupted from the crowd. A small figure darted between the security guards, a girl no more than 12, her clothes worn but clean. She stopped directly in front of Maxwell, her dark eyes blazing with an intensity that made him take a step back. "You don't have a heart," she shouted, her voice carrying across the suddenly hushed crowd. "You're destroying people's homes and you don't even care." The words hit Maxwell like a physical blow. For a moment he was transported back to another time, another place, a small apartment above a laundromat, his mother's tired face as she counted coins at the kitchen table, the smell of someone else's clean clothes drifting up through the floorboards. Security moved to intercept the girl, but Maxwell waved them off. She stood her ground, tears streaming down her face, clutching a worn backpack to her chest. Behind her, Mrs. Crawford was being helped into a waiting car, her few possessions packed into 2 small suitcases. "This is progress," Maxwell said, more to himself than the girl. "Sometimes progress comes at a price." "Progress?" The girl's voice cracked. "Is that what you call making people homeless? My mom used to work for you. Now we live in shelters because of your progress." Before Maxwell could respond, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving him standing alone in the shadow of the mansion he was about to destroy. The gathered protesters began to disperse, their angry murmurs fading into the afternoon air. Richard appeared at his side, tablet in hand. "Everything's proceeding according to schedule. We'll have the demolition permits by morning." Maxwell nodded mechanically, but his eyes were fixed on the spot where the girl had stood. Her words echoed in his mind, stirring memories he'd spent years burying under spreadsheets and profit margins. "Max?" Richard's voice held a note of concern. "You're not getting sentimental, are you? Remember, this is business, nothing personal." "Of course," Maxwell replied, straightening his tie. "Nothing personal." But as he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a car window. For the first time in years, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. The next morning, Maxwell found himself standing before the Victorian mansion again. The protesters were gone, leaving only scattered pamphlets dancing in the early morning breeze. He hadn't slept well, the girl's words and Mrs. Crawford's dignified exit playing on repeat in his mind. Using his master key, he unlocked the front door. The security team wouldn't arrive for another hour, giving him time to conduct one final inspection before the demolition crews moved in. At least that's what he told himself. In truth, he wasn't sure why he was here. The house creaked beneath his expensive leather shoes as he moved through the rooms. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, illuminating patches of worn carpet and faded wallpaper. The air held the weight of accumulated memories, pressing against him with each step. In what must have been the living room, a few pieces of furniture remained, draped in white sheets, like ghosts of a life interrupted. Maxwell pulled back one of the sheets, revealing an antique mirror. His reflection stared back at him, tie slightly askew, the first signs of grey at his temples he usually pretended not to notice. He continued his exploration, moving upstairs. The second floor held several bedrooms, most already emptied. In what appeared to be Mrs. Crawford's room, a few personal items remained scattered about. A hairbrush on the dresser, a novel dog-eared on the nightstand, a knitting basket in the corner. Then something caught his eye. A cardboard box partially hidden beneath the bed. Maxwell hesitated, then knelt down and pulled it out. Inside was an old photo album, its cover thick with dust. He opened it, and his world tilted on its axis. There, on the very first page, was a photograph that stopped his breath. A young boy with unruly dark hair sat on a porch swing, sandwiched between two women, one elderly, whom he recognized as his grandmother, and the other, Mrs. Crawford, decades younger, but unmistakable. Memory hit him like a wave. The porch, swing, the cookies that always seemed to be fresh from the oven, the gentle voice reading stories on rainy afternoons. Mrs. Crawford had been his grandmother's best friend, the neighbor who'd watched him after school while his mother worked double shifts at the diner. Maxwell sank to the floor, the album heavy in his lap. Page after page revealed moments he'd locked away. Birthday parties with homemade cake, summer afternoons in the garden, Christmas mornings with modest but carefully wrapped presents. In each photo, Mrs. Crawford was there, a constant presence in a childhood he'd tried so hard to forget. His phone buzzed, making him jump. A text from Richard. "Demolition crew arriving in 30 minutes. Everything on schedule?" Maxwell's hands shook. As he stared at the message, the girl's words from yesterday merged with the photographs in front of him. "You don't have a heart." How had he not recognized Mrs. Crawford? How had he become someone who could forget such kindness? He found himself moving through the rooms again, but now each space held echoes of memories. The kitchen where Mrs. Crawford had taught him to bake cookies. The back door where she'd waited every afternoon, watching until he was safely inside before heading to her own home. The window seat where she'd held him the day his grandmother passed away, promising that he would never be alone. Another text from Richard. "Max, need confirmation on demo start time." Maxwell looked around the room, really seeing it for the first time. Beneath the wear of years and neglect, this wasn't just another property to be cleared. This was where his childhood self had found safety and warmth when his own home had been cold and empty. His phone buzzed again, more insistent this time. Richard was calling now, probably wondering why he wasn't responding to the texts. Maxwell let it ring, his attention caught by something else. A small bracelet made of wooden beads lying forgotten on the window seat. He picked it up, recognition flooding through him. He had made this in Mrs. Crawford's kitchen, his small hands carefully stringing the beads while she supervised, praising his concentration. The sound of trucks arriving outside pulled him back to the present. The demolition crew was here, ready to reduce this house of memories to rubble. Through the window, he could see Richard stepping out of his BMW, tablet in hand as always, efficiency personified. Maxwell looked down at the photo album and bracelet in his hands, then at his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him now bore little resemblance to the boy in those photographs. Somewhere along the way, in his drive to rise above, his humble beginnings, he had buried not just the memories of struggle, but also the memories of love and kindness that had helped him survive. Maxwell's finger hovered over his phone screen, the demolition crew's engines humming outside. Through the dusty window, he could see Richard gesturing impatiently, pointing at his watch. The weight of the photo album in his other hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. "Mr. Bennett," a worker's voice called from downstairs, "we're ready to begin when you give the word." He looked around the room one last time, memories flooding back with overwhelming clarity. The decision he was about to make would affect more than just his business reputation. It would define who he truly was. "Max!" Richard's voice boomed from the entrance. "What's the holdup? We're burning daylight here." His footsteps echoed through the house as he climbed the stairs. Maxwell quickly slipped the photo album into his briefcase, just as Richard appeared in the doorway, his perfectly pressed suit a stark contrast to the room's faded wallpaper. "Everything okay?" Richard's eyes narrowed, taking in Maxwell's slightly disheveled appearance. "You're not usually one for last-minute inspections." "I've been thinking," Maxwell began, choosing his words carefully. "Perhaps we should consider an alternative approach to this development." Richard's friendly facade dropped instantly. "An alternative approach? We've invested millions in this project. The board is expecting us to break ground next week." "What if we preserved the mansion?" Maxwell suggested, surprising himself with the words. "We could incorporate it into the design, make it a centerpiece of the development. Something unique that honors the neighborhood's history." Richard's laugh was sharp and without humor. "You can't be serious. This isn't like you, Max. Since when do you care about old buildings and neighborhood history?" "Things change," Maxwell replied, straightening his shoulders. "People change." "No." Richard stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "People like us don't change. We make things change. That's who we are. That's how we got here." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a group of reporters gathering at the property line, cameras ready. Richard's expression shifted from anger to calculation. "I've already arranged for press coverage of the demolition," he said smoothly. "Think about how it would look if we backed out now. The board would question your judgment, investors would lose confidence." Maxwell moved to the window, watching as more media vehicles arrived. "You planned this," he realized. "You're forcing my hand." "I'm protecting our interests," Richard corrected. "And yours. Remember who helped you climb out of obscurity, Max. Remember who taught you how this game is played." The sound of more vehicles arriving drew Maxwell's attention back to the street. A familiar car had pulled up. Mrs. Crawford's social worker was helping her out of the back seat. Even from this distance, he could see the devastation on her face as she watched the demolition crews positioning their equipment. "Why is she here?" Maxwell demanded. Richard shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. "Public relations. The media loves a good story about progress and change. The old making way for the new. It humanizes the process." "Humanizes?" Maxwell's voice rose. "You brought her here to watch us destroy her home?" "Our legal team advised that having her sign the final papers on site would help prevent any future litigation," Richard explained, checking something on his tablet. "Plus, it makes for better photos." The casual cruelty of it all hit Maxwell like a physical blow. He thought of the photos in his briefcase, of the kindness Mrs. Crawford had shown him when he was just a poor kid with nothing to offer in return. Now here he was, about to repay that kindness with destruction, all for the sake of profit margins and shareholder value. "Call it off," Maxwell said quietly. "Excuse me?" "Call off the demolition, now." Richard's face hardened. "You're not thinking clearly. Perhaps the stress of the project is getting to you. Why don't you take the day off? I can handle things here." "I said call it off," Maxwell repeated, his voice carrying the authority that had made him one of the most powerful developers in the city. "Or I'll do it myself." Think very carefully about what you're doing, Richard warned. This isn't just about one old house. Your entire reputation is built on being decisive, on making the hard choices. If you show weakness now— Weakness? Maxwell interrupted. Is that what you call having a conscience? Before Richard could respond, movement in the crowd caught Maxwell's attention. The girl from yesterday had returned, standing next to Mrs. Crawford, her small hand clasped tightly in the older woman's. Something about seeing them together, united in their pain, broke through the last of Maxwell's hesitation. He pulled out his phone and dialed the demolition company's number, aware of Richard's increasingly agitated protests. The choice before him was clear: continue down the path that had brought him wealth and power, or find the courage to become someone his younger self wouldn't be ashamed of. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of emergency board meetings and heated confrontations. Maxwell sat in his office as the sun set, his tie loosened and jacket discarded, watching news coverage of the day's events play out on multiple screens. A development titan halts controversial project, one headline proclaimed. Historic Victorian mansion saved at 11th hour, declared another. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since he'd made the announcement, but he'd instructed his assistant to hold all calls. A gentle knock at his door broke through his thoughts. Sarah Chen, his project manager, entered with a stack of papers. "The preliminary numbers you asked for," she said, placing them on his desk. "The cost of redesigning the project to preserve the mansion will be substantial, but not impossible." Maxwell nodded, grateful for her efficiency. "And the other matter?" Sarah pulled out a tablet, bringing up a series of images. "We found her. The security cameras caught her heading toward Franklin Park most evenings. Based on the footage, she appears to be staying somewhere in that area." Maxwell studied the grainy images of the young girl who had confronted him. In each frame, she clutched the same worn backpack, moving with the careful alertness of someone used to being invisible. "Her name is Lucy Martinez," Sarah continued. "Her mother, Maria Martinez, worked in our accounting department until the downsizing 3 years ago. After losing her job, she—" "I remember," Maxwell interrupted softly. He did remember now. The efficiency experts' recommendations, the cold calculations of cost-cutting measures. How many lives had been upended by decisions he'd made without a second thought? A commotion in the outer office drew their attention. Richard burst in, ignoring the assistant's protests. "The board is in chaos," he announced without preamble. "Shareholders are panicking. What were you thinking, Max?" "I was thinking it's time we did things differently," Maxwell replied, standing. "The redesign will actually create more value in the long run, a unique blend of historic preservation and modern development." "This isn't about the project anymore," Richard's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You're compromising everything we've built. First the demolition. Now I hear you're having our people search for some homeless girl. Have you lost your mind?" "No." Maxwell met his partner's gaze steadily. "I think I'm finally finding it again." Richard's expression shifted, from anger to calculation. "The board meeting tomorrow, they'll want answers, Max. Real answers. Not this sentimental nonsense about preservation and community values." "I'll give them answers," Maxwell assured him. "Just not the ones you're expecting." After Richard stormed out, Sarah lingered. "There's one more thing you should know," she said hesitantly. "About Mrs. Crawford. The social worker says she's been refusing to eat, barely sleeping. The change in routine, the stress of everything, it's taking a toll." Maxwell's chest tightened. He picked up the photo album from his desk, running his fingers over its worn cover. "Where is she now?" "At the Golden Age Care Center on Pine Street. But visiting hours are over." Maxwell was already reaching for his jacket. "Get me the address." The care center was quiet when he arrived, but his reputation and a generous donation granted him access. He found Mrs. Crawford sitting in a small room, staring out a window at a view of concrete and traffic. "Ellen," he said softly, using her first name for the first time in decades. She turned, her eyes taking a moment to focus on him. "Maxwell? Little Max?" For a moment, he saw recognition flash across her face, then fade into confusion. "No. You're that man, the one who took my home." "Yes," he admitted, pulling a chair closer to hers. But before that, a long time ago, I was little Max, the boy who spent afternoons in your kitchen, who always wanted one more cookie, one more story." He opened the photo album, turning to a page that showed a Christmas morning from long ago. A small boy sat surrounded by carefully wrapped presents, beaming at the camera. "You made me a sweater that year," he remembered. "Blue with snowflakes. You said blue brought out my eyes." Mrs. Crawford touched the photograph with trembling fingers. "Max," she whispered, really seeing him now. "Oh, my dear boy. What happened? To you?" The question struck him like an arrow to the heart. "I forgot who I was," he answered honestly, "but I'm trying to remember." He stayed with her for hours, long past visiting hours, sharing memories and stories. She remembered details about his childhood that he'd forgotten, his favorite books, the way he'd help her garden, his dreams of building things that would touch the sky. "You wanted to make the world better," she said as he prepared to leave. "Not bigger, not richer, better." On his way out, he passed a small chapel in the care center. The last time he'd set foot in any kind of church had been at his grandmother's farewell. But now he found himself drawn inside, sitting in the quiet darkness. The girl's words echoed in his mind. "You don't have a heart." She'd been wrong. He realized. He had a heart. He'd just buried it so deep he'd forgotten how to feel it beat. The morning of the board meeting dawned grey and cold. Maxwell adjusted his tie in his office mirror, noticing the dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept much, spending most of the night reviewing old company files, particularly those concerning the layoffs 3 years ago. Sarah knocked on his door, tablet in hand. "I found something you need to see," she said, closing the door behind her. "About the Martinez case. The efficiency report that led to the downsizing. There are irregularities." Maxwell took the tablet, scanning through the documents. His frown deepened with each page. "These projections were manipulated," he said, finally. "The department wasn't actually underperforming. Someone wanted those people gone." "There's more." Sarah swiped to another document. "The severance packages were reduced far below company policy. The savings were redirected to a subsidiary company, one registered to Richard Sterling." The revelation hit Maxwell like a punch to the gut. He thought of Maria Martinez, Lucy's mother, forced out of her job based on fraudulent data. How many other families had been affected by Richard's schemes? His office phone buzzed. "Mr. Bennett, the board is assembling in the main conference room." "Thank you, Sarah." Maxwell gathered his materials. "Keep digging and see if you can find Maria Martinez, her current workplace, living situation, anything." The boardroom was tense when Maxwell entered. 12 faces turned to watch him, their expressions ranging from concern to outright hostility. Richard sat at the far end, his usual smooth confidence firmly in place. "Gentlemen, ladies," Maxwell began, setting his briefcase on the table, "I know you're all concerned about recent events, about my decision to halt the Highland Square demolition, about the direction of this company." "Concerned is an understatement," Board Member Thompson interrupted. "This project represents millions in investment. The delay is already affecting our stock price. And your personal involvement with the displaced resident raises questions about your judgment," another board member added. Maxwell noticed Richard's slight smile at these rehearsed-sounding complaints. How long had his partner been laying this groundwork? "Before we continue," Maxwell said, "I'd like to share some information about our company's practices over the past few years." He began distributing folders to each board member, particularly concerning the efficiency initiatives of 2022. Richard's smile faltered slightly. "Max, is this really relevant to the current situation?" "Absolutely," Maxwell continued, "because it speaks to the heart of who we are as a company, what we've become." He opened his own folder. 3 years ago, we laid off 37 employees based on an efficiency report that claimed their departments were underperforming. That report, as you'll see, was fabricated. The room erupted in murmurs as board members began reviewing the documents. Richard's face had gone pale. "The true numbers showed those departments were actually exceeding expectations," Maxwell continued. "The layoffs were unnecessary, but they did generate significant cost savings, savings that were funneled into a shell company registered under a familiar name. All eyes turned to Richard, who was now gripping his pen so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "This is absurd," Richard stood abruptly. "These allegations are completely unfounded. Maxwell is clearly suffering from some sort of breakdown. First the demolition, now these wild accusations. The documentation is quite clear," Board Member Thompson said quietly, still reading. "These signatures, these transfers. Mr. Sterling, can you explain this?" But Richard was already heading for the door. "My lawyer will be in touch. This is slander, pure and simple. Security is waiting outside," Maxwell said calmly, "along with representatives from the SEC. They're very interested in discussing these financial irregularities." As Richard was escorted from the building, Maxwell remained in the boardroom addressing the shocked directors. "Ladies and gentlemen, this company needs to change. Not just its practices, but its very purpose. The Highland Square project isn't being cancelled, it's being transformed." He pulled out architectural sketches Sarah had helped him prepare. "Through the night. Imagine a development that preserves history while creating something new. The Victorian mansion becomes a community centre, surrounded by mixed-income housing and local businesses. Not just another luxury shopping complex, but a place that serves the entire community." "The profit margins would be lower," someone pointed out. "Initially, yes," Maxwell agreed, "but we'll be building something sustainable, something that adds real value to the city, something we can be proud of." As the board members studied the new plans, Maxwell's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, "Found Maria Martinez. You're not going to believe where she's working." Maxwell looked at the address and his heart sank. The pieces were falling into place now, a pattern of destruction that had rippled out from their corporate decisions, affecting real lives, in ways they'd never bothered to consider. The factory outlet mall on the outskirts of town was a far cry from the gleaming office towers of downtown. Maxwell parked his Mercedes in the crowded lot, feeling increasingly out of place in his tailored suit. According to Sarah's information, Maria Martinez worked here as a maintenance supervisor, covering the overnight shift. He found her in a back corridor, mopping up a spill. She looked older than he remembered, her face lined with exhaustion, but there was still pride in the way she held herself. "Mrs. Martinez," he called softly. She turned, recognition and anger flashing across her face. "Mr. Bennett, come to eliminate more jobs?" "No," he said, maintaining a respectful distance. "I came to apologize, and to try to make things right." Maria leaned on her mop, studying him with weary skepticism. "Make things right? Do you know what happened after your efficiency initiative? 3 months behind on rent, eviction notice. My daughter," her voice caught. "Lucy stopped believing in everything, school, home, future. It all became temporary to her. Something that could be taken away at any moment." Each word hit Maxwell like a physical blow. "I recently learned that the layoffs were based on falsified reports. It doesn't excuse my role. I should have verified the data myself. But I want to help now if you'll let me." "Help?" Maria's laugh was bitter. "Like you helped Mrs. Crawford? Lucy told me what happened at the mansion. She was there because that's where we used to live, in the apartment over the garage. Mrs. Crawford let us stay there after everything. Now that's gone too." Maxwell hadn't known this connection, and it made everything worse. His actions hadn't just displaced one person, they'd created a cascade of hardship affecting multiple lives. "The mansion isn't being demolished," he said quietly, "and I'm here to offer you your old job back. Not just back, a promotion. We're restructuring the company, creating new positions focused on community impact assessment. Given your experience, both professional and personal, you'd be perfect for the role." Maria's expression remained guarded. "And Lucy? What about her education? Her future?" "There's a scholarship fund being established for all the children of employees affected by the layoffs. Full college coverage plus support for any immediate educational needs." He paused. "But first we need to find her." Something shifted in Maria's eyes. "You don't know where she is?" "She was last seen near Franklin Park, but the trail goes cold after that. If you could help us." "My shift ends in 20 minutes, Maria said after a long moment. "Wait here." While Maria finished her work, Maxwell called Sarah with an update. The board had unanimously approved the new direction for Highland Square, especially after the full extent of Richard's financial manipulations came to light. The Victorian mansion would indeed become a community centre, with Mrs. Crawford as its honorary director, once she was strong enough to leave the care facility. Maria returned, having changed out of her work uniform. "There's a place," she said, leading Maxwell to her old Toyota. "An abandoned recreation centre near the park. Lucy goes there sometimes. She thinks I don't know, but mothers, we always know more than our children think." They drove in silence through the darkening city. The recreation centre loomed ahead, its windows boarded up, graffiti covering its walls. Maria parked behind the building. "There," she pointed to a faint light visible through a basement window. "That's where the neighborhood kids gather. They look out for each other." Maxwell followed Maria around the building. The basement entrance was partially hidden behind overgrown bushes. Maria knocked on the door in a specific pattern. After a long moment, the door creaked open. Lucy stood there, her eyes widening, in recognition and fear when she saw Maxwell. "Mom?" Her voice trembled. "What's he doing here?" "Trying to fix his mistakes," Maria answered softly. "Like I taught you, we should always try to do." Lucy looked between them, clutching her worn backpack. Behind her, Maxwell could see other young faces in the shadows, all watching with the wariness of those who had learned too early not to trust in promises. "I was wrong," Maxwell said simply, "about everything. The mansion, the layoffs, all of it. I forgot what it means to be part of a community, to care about more than just profits. You reminded me when you said I had no heart. You were right. I'd locked mine away, but I'm learning to listen to it again." Lucy's grip on her backpack loosened slightly. "Mrs. Crawford told me stories about you," she said, "about when you were a kid. She said you wanted to build things that would make people's lives better." "I did," Maxwell nodded. "And I want to do that again. But I need help. From people who understand what better really means. People like you and your mother." A distant siren wailed, making everyone tense. This was no place for children, Maxwell realized. No place for anyone. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Maxwell stood in the restored garden of the Victorian mansion, watching workers carefully repair the weathered trim and replace broken windows. The morning sun cast long shadows across the freshly planted flower beds, Mrs. Crawford's favorites, recreated from his childhood memories. "The community center plans are finalized," Sarah reported, walking up beside him with her ever-present tablet. "The contractors say we can start the interior renovations next week." Maxwell nodded, his attention drawn to a group touring the property. Maria Martinez led the way, clipboard in hand, speaking animatedly to representatives from local non-profit organizations. In just 2 weeks as Community Impact Director, she had already established partnerships with dozens of community groups. "The after-school program has already received over 100 applications," Sarah continued, "and the job training center is generating a lot of interest. We may need to expand that section of the building." Lucy appeared from around the corner of the house, showing a group of younger children the newly established community garden plots. Her entire demeanor had changed since that night at the recreation center. Now she moved with purpose, pride evident in her role as youth program coordinator. "Mr. Bennett," a small voice interrupted his thoughts. One of the children had broken away from Lucy's tour group. "Is it true you used to live here too?" Maxwell knelt down to the child's level. "Not in this house, but nearby. Mrs. Crawford, I used to take care of me after school, just like she'll help take care of you and your friends once she's feeling better." The child's face lit up. "Lucy said Mrs. Crawford tells the best stories." "That she does," Maxwell smiled, "and soon she'll be here to tell them again." As the child ran back to join the tour group, Maxwell's phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. Urgent news about Richard Sterling. He excused himself and headed inside, finding a quiet corner in what would soon become the center's library. The news article his assistant had sent was already making waves. "Former executive faces additional charges in financial scandal." According to the report, investigators had uncovered a pattern of fraud extending far beyond the efficiency reports. Richard had been systematically undermining communities, driving down property values through various shell companies, then acquiring the depreciated properties for development projects. "I should have seen it sooner," Maxwell muttered to himself, thinking of all the neighborhoods they'd transformed over the years. How many lives had been disrupted by their relentless pursuit of profit? A commotion at the front of the house drew his attention. He heard excited voices and hurried to investigate. His heart skipped a beat at the sight that greeted him. Mrs. Crawford stood in the entrance hall, supported by her social worker, but very much present. Her eyes were bright as she took in the ongoing restoration work. "Ellen," Maxwell rushed forward to help her to a comfortable chair. "We weren't expecting you until next week." "I couldn't wait," she smiled, patting his hand. "The doctors say a familiar environment might help with my recovery, and where could be more familiar than home?" Lucy appeared with a glass of water, hovering nervously nearby until Mrs. Crawford beckoned her closer. "Come here, child. Maxwell tells me you've been helping with the garden." As Lucy eagerly described the vegetable plots and flower beds they'd planted, Maxwell watched the interaction with a full heart. The mansion was coming back to life, not just in its physical restoration, but in the way it was already beginning to serve its new purpose. Maria joined them, carrying architectural plans for the next phase of renovation. "We've had an idea," she began, spreading the drawings on a nearby table. "The old carriage house at the back of the property. We could convert it into transitional housing for families in need." Maxwell studied the plans, noting the careful attention to both functionality and dignity in the design. "How many families could it accommodate?" 6 units, Maria replied. "It's not much, but it's a start," Mrs. Crawford finished for her. "Everything important starts small, like seeds in a garden." The wisdom in her words struck Maxwell deeply. He thought of his own journey, how it had started with a child's shout in the street and grown into something he could never have imagined. Sarah appeared in the doorway. "Sorry to interrupt, but the community board members are here for the walkthrough, and the local news crew is requesting an interview about the center's programs." Maxwell looked at the group gathered around Mrs. Crawford's chair, Maria with her architectural plans, Lucy with her garden updates, the future taking shape in their shared vision. "Tell them we'll do the interview here," he decided. "All of us together. This isn't just my story to tell anymore." The autumn breeze carried the scent of fresh paint and newly turned earth as Maxwell walked through the mansion's restored halls. 3 months had passed since the day Mrs. Crawford returned home, and the transformation was remarkable, not just of the building, but of the lives within it. He paused at the entrance to what had once been the formal dining room, now converted into a bustling study space. Lucy sat at one of the tables, surrounded by younger children helping them with their homework. Her own grades had improved dramatically since starting back at school, and she'd recently been talking about becoming a teacher. "The tutoring program is our most successful initiative so far," Maria said, joining him at the doorway. She'd traded her maintenance uniform for business casual attire, but she still carried herself with the same quiet dignity. "We're getting requests from other neighborhoods to expand the program." Maxwell nodded, making a mental note. "We should discuss that at the next board meeting. The foundation's resources are meant to be shared." The Bennett Community Foundation had emerged from the ashes of the Highland Square project, with a mission to preserve and revitalize historic neighborhoods while supporting their residents. The board now included community leaders alongside business experts, ensuring a balance between progress and preservation. They made their way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Crawford was teaching a cooking class to a group of adults, former homeless individuals now participating in the center's job training program. The smell of fresh-baked cookies brought back memories of Maxwell's own childhood afternoons in this kitchen. "Just in time," Mrs. Crawford called out, pulling a tray from the oven. "Everyone needs to taste test these before they go to the youth center opening tomorrow." The kitchen erupted in laughter as Maxwell and Maria were pressed into service as cookie critics. The warmth in the room went beyond the heat of the ovens. It was the warmth of community, of belonging, of purpose restored. Sarah found them there, somehow managing to look professional while holding a half-eaten cookie. The final inspection for the carriage house apartments is complete. We can start moving families in next week. Excellent, Maxwell replied. And the other matter? Sarah nodded, understanding his reference. The investigators finished their review of Sterling Properties' activities. They've identified 17 other neighborhoods that were targeted over the past decade. The Foundation's legal team is already working on restitution plans. The news sobered the mood slightly. Richard's schemes had caused damage that would take years to fully address. But at least now they were working to make things right. A commotion from the front of the house drew their attention. Lucy burst into the kitchen, waving a paper excitedly. "Mom, Mr. Bennett, look." She thrust the document forward. A perfect score on her latest math test. Maria embraced her daughter, tears of pride in her eyes. Maxwell remembered the frightened, angry girl who had confronted him months ago and marveled at the transformation. "This calls for a celebration," Mrs. Crawford declared, pulling out ingredients for another batch of cookies. "Lucy, would you like to help? I seem to remember another young person who always wanted to learn the secret recipe." Maxwell smiled, recognizing his own childhood enthusiasm in Lucy's eager nod. As they worked together at the counter, he pulled Sarah aside. "How are the plans coming for the recreation center renovation?" "On schedule," she replied. "The city council approved our proposal to convert it into a youth sports and arts complex. Construction starts next month." "Good, those kids deserve a real place to gather, not an abandoned basement." The afternoon light slanted through the restored stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the kitchen floor. Maxwell watched as Mrs. Crawford guided Lucy's hands in measuring ingredients, just as she had done with him so many years ago. Maria sat at the kitchen table, reviewing program proposals for the foundation, while occasionally glancing up to smile at tea. Her daughter. A delivery person appeared at the kitchen door with a large package. "Historic Preservation Award," Sarah explained as Maxwell opened it, "for the mansion's restoration." The plaque was elegant, but Maxwell's attention was drawn to the inscription. "For outstanding contribution to community heritage and development." Below the formal text, someone had added a handwritten note, "Where progress meets preservation, humanity thrives." He placed the award on a kitchen shelf, between a row of cookbooks and a framed photograph of the mansion's original construction. The past and present, finally finding harmony. The winter sun cast long shadows through the mansion's windows as Maxwell reviewed the quarterly reports in his new office, a modest room compared to his former corporate suite, but somehow more satisfying. The walls were adorned with children's artwork from the center's after-school program and a worn wooden desk that Mrs. Crawford insisted had belonged to the mansion's original owner sat in the corner. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah entered, followed by an unexpected visitor, Thompson, his former board member from Bennett Developments. "Hope I'm not interrupting," Thompson said, taking in the transformed space with obvious curiosity. "Quite a change from the 35th floor." Maxwell stood to greet him. "Everything's a change these days. What brings you here, James?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "The news about Sterling Properties has everyone rattled. More developments are coming to light. Shell companies, fraudulent permits, community displacement strategies. It's worse than we thought." "How many neighborhoods?" Maxwell asked, though he dreaded the answer. 23 confirmed now across 3 states. The SEC is expanding their investigation." Thompson paused. "But that's not why I'm here. The board... We've been watching what you're doing here. This foundation, the community programs, the restoration projects. It's not what any of us expected, but the results are undeniable." Sarah pulled up some figures on her tablet. "Our community impact metrics show significant improvements in educational outcomes, job placement rates, and housing stability. The foundation's model is proving more sustainable than traditional development approaches." "Exactly," Thompson nodded. "Which is why I'm here with a proposal. Several board members want to establish a partnership between Bennett Developments and your foundation. We're ready to commit significant resources to expand this model to other communities." Maxwell leaned back in his chair, studying his former colleague. "The same board that thought preserving this mansion was financial suicide." "We were wrong," Thompson admitted. "You showed us a different way forward, But we need your expertise to make it work." Before Maxwell could respond, excited voices echoed from the hallway. Lucy burst in, followed by a group of students from the center's youth leadership program. "Mr. Bennett, we won!" Lucy was practically bouncing with excitement. "The city council approved our proposal for the community garden expansion." The students had spent months developing a plan to convert several vacant lots near the mansion into an urban farming initiative. Maxwell had helped them navigate the bureaucratic process, but the work had been entirely their own. Thompson watched, the interaction with interest, as Maxwell congratulated the students and reviewed their presentation materials. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, after the excited group had left. "You're not just developing properties anymore. You're developing people's potential. That's what real progress looks like." Mrs. Crawford's voice came from the doorway. She entered slowly, supported by her cane, but growing stronger each day. It's what Maxwell understood as a boy, before he forgot for a while. Maxwell smiled at her gentle rebuke. "I had some excellent teachers to remind me." A commotion from outside drew them to the window. Maria was directing a group of workers installing new playground equipment in the mansion's side yard. The space had been designed with input from local families, incorporating accessible features for children with disabilities. "We've identified 5 neighborhoods in the city that could benefit from similar community centers," Thompson continued. "Properties that were previously slated for luxury development. With the foundation's expertise and the company's resources—" "It's not that simple," Maxwell interrupted. "This isn't about dropping pre-planned solutions into different neighborhoods. Each community has its own needs, its own history, its own voice. That's what we lost sight of before." "Then teach us," Thompson urged. "Help us understand how to do it right." Sarah cleared her throat. "Actually, we've been developing a community engagement framework based on our experience here. Maria's team has documented the process, including mistakes made and lessons learned." Maxwell looked around the room, at Mrs. Crawford, who had given him his first lessons in compassion, at Sarah, who had helped transform corporate efficiency into community effectiveness, at the children's artwork that reminded him daily of why their work mattered. "We'll need to establish clear guidelines," he said finally. "Ethical standards, community oversight, transparent governance. No more shortcuts, no more pushing people aside in the name of progress." Thompson nodded eagerly. "Of course. Whatever it takes." "And one more thing," Maxwell added. "The first step in any new project will be listening. Really listening to the people whose lives we're affecting. That's non-negotiable." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of children's laughter drifted up from the playground below. Lucy was leading a game, her voice confident and clear as she organized the younger kids into teams. Spring arrived with a burst of color in the mansion's restored gardens. Maxwell stood on the front porch, watching as families gathered for the community center's first anniversary celebration. The transformation from that tense day of the attempted demolition seemed almost miraculous, yet he knew it was the result of countless small acts of dedication and care. Maria approached, clipboard in hand as usual, but now it was accompanied by the confident bearing of someone who knew their true worth. "The reporters are here for the interview. Are you ready?" Maxwell nodded, but his attention was caught by a particular scene unfolding near the garden. Lucy was showing a group of new children around the property, her manner a perfect blend of authority and kindness. Among them was a small boy clutching his mother's hand, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "That's Michael and his mum," Maria explained, following Maxwell's gaze. "They just moved into one of the carriage house apartments. Former Sterling Properties development displaced them from their previous neighborhood." Maxwell watched as Lucy knelt down to the boy's level, saying something that made him smile. She pointed out the vegetable gardens, the playground, the study rooms visible through the windows. Gradually, the boy's grip on his mother's hand loosened. "She's good with them," Maxwell observed. "She understands them," Maria corrected. "She knows what it's like to feel lost and how much difference a safe place can make." They made their way to the mansion's newly renovated sunroom, where Mrs. Crawford was already seated for the interview. Her health had improved remarkably over the past year, which she attributed to having a purpose again, as she liked to say. The reporter, a thoughtful-looking woman with quick eyes, set up her recording equipment. "I've been following this story since the day of the almost demolition," she began. "But I'm curious about what happened before that moment. Mr. Bennett, what made you change your mind?" Maxwell glanced at Lucy, who had joined them with her young charges. "Someone very brave told me I had no heart," he said. "She was wrong. I had just forgotten how to use it." The interview continued, with each person adding their perspective to the story. Mrs. Crawford spoke about the power of remembering who you truly are. Maria described the journey from anger to purpose. Lucy, now poised and articulate, explained her vision for the youth leadership program she was developing. "And the Foundation's future plans?" the reporter prompted. "We're expanding, but carefully," Maxwell explained. "Each project is unique, shaped by the community it serves. We're currently working with 5 other neighborhoods, learning from each one." "Learning seems to be a key theme here," the reporter observed. "It never stops," Mrs. Crawford interjected with a smile. "Even an old teacher like me learns something new every day." After the interview, Maxwell found himself back on the porch, watching the celebration unfold. Children played on the new playground equipment while their parents chatted with Program C. Coordinators. Local artists had set up displays of work created in the center's studios. The air was filled with music from the youth band practice room. Sarah joined him, taking a rare break from her organizational duties. "The board approved the expansion budget," she reported, "and the city council wants to use our community engagement model as a template for future development projects." Maxwell nodded, but his attention was drawn to a scene at the garden gate. A new family was arriving, a grandmother and her grandson looking uncertain but hopeful. Lucy and Michael, the boy from earlier, were already moving to welcome them. "Do you see that?" Mrs. Crawford's voice came from behind them. She had wheeled herself onto the porch to enjoy the afternoon sun. "How the children who were helped become the ones who help. That's how real change happens." Maxwell watched as Michael shyly offered to show the new boy the vegetable garden he had helped plant. Lucy supervised from a distance, understanding the importance of letting them form their own connection. "I've been thinking about the reporter's question," Maxwell said, "about what made me change. It wasn't just one moment or one person. It was remembering who I was before I learned to value the wrong things, and it was seeing the possibility of who I could become." "The heart never really forgets," Mrs. Crawford said softly. "It just needs reminding sometimes." The afternoon. Light turned golden, casting long shadows across the mansion's restored facade. From inside came the smell of fresh-baked cookies, Mrs. Crawford's recipe, now being taught in the culinary training program. Children's laughter mingled with adult conversations, creating a symphony of community that Maxwell had forgotten could exist. "We're not just preserving a building," he realized aloud. "We're preserving the possibility of connection, of growth, of second chances." "And third chances," Mrs. Crawford added with a knowing smile. "And fourth and fifth, as many as it takes. That's what a real home provides." The summer heat shimmered above the mansion's restored slate roof as Maxwell reviewed the latest community impact reports in the garden. The scent of blooming roses, Mrs. Crawford's pride and joy, drifted on the warm breeze, mingling with the sounds of children playing nearby. "The numbers are remarkable," Sarah said, scrolling through data on her tablet. 87% of our job training program graduates are now employed full-time. The Youth Mentorship Initiative has helped improve school attendance rates by 40%, and the waiting list for the Carriage House apartments keeps growing. Maxwell nodded, but his attention was drawn to a more immediate measure of success. Lucy leading a tour group through the garden. She had grown into her role as youth program coordinator with remarkable grace, and today she was showing a special visitor around, the mayor's education advisor. "Our student-led initiatives are particularly effective," Lucy was explaining, her confidence evident in every gesture. "When young people feel ownership of their learning space, they're more motivated to succeed. Take our science garden, for example." She led the group to a section of carefully tended plots where younger students were conducting soil experiments. Michael, the once shy boy who had arrived just months ago, was now enthusiastically explaining the difference between various composting methods to his peers. "I remember when you could barely get him to speak above a whisper," Maria commented, joining Maxwell at the garden table. She had just returned from a meeting with city planners about expanding the foundation's model to other neighborhoods. "People bloom when they're given the right conditions to grow," Mrs. Crawford's voice came from behind them. She maneuvered her wheelchair along the garden path, looking particularly pleased. "Just like my roses." A commotion at the front gate drew their attention. A group of business people in suits was arriving, led by Thompson. Maxwell recognized several prominent developers among them, former competitors who had once mocked his sentimental approach to community development. "Word's getting around," Sarah explained. "They want to see how we've managed to make this model both socially impactful and financially sustainable." Maxwell watched as Lucy smoothly incorporated the new group into her tour. She had developed an impressive ability to communicate their mission to any audience, from skeptical investors to nervous new families. "The key is understanding that real value isn't just about property appreciation," she was telling the developers. "It's about human appreciation. When you invest in people's potential, the returns go far beyond monetary measures." One of the EO developers, a woman Maxwell recognized as the CEO of a major construction company, was taking careful notes. "And the operational costs?" she asked. "Lower than traditional development models in the long run," Maria stepped in, pulling up detailed spreadsheets on her tablet. "Community engagement reduces vandalism and maintenance issues. Resident-led programs create a sense of ownership that translates to better property preservation. And our job training programs provide a skilled local workforce for ongoing operations." Maxwell smiled, remembering how he used to view such metrics solely through the lens of profit and loss. Now he understood that true success could be measured in the confidence in Lucy's voice, the pride in Maria's bearing, the joy in Mrs. Crawford's eyes as she watched her beloved mansion serve its new purpose. Thompson approached Maxwell while the others continued the tour. "You've started something here that can't be ignored," he said quietly. "The old way of doing things, pushing people out, tearing communities apart, it's becoming unsustainable. More and more developers are realizing they need to change." "Change isn't easy," Maxwell acknowledged, thinking of his own journey. "It requires more than just new business models. It requires new ways of seeing, new ways of listening." A burst of laughter drew their attention to the science garden, where Michael was demonstrating the results of his composting experiment. Something had clearly gone entertainingly wrong, judging by the giggles and the smell, but instead of being embarrassed, he was turning it into a lesson about the scientific method. "I've been thinking about what you said last time," Thompson continued, "about really listening to communities. We're preparing to redevelop several properties in the Oakland area, and I was hoping your team could consult on the community engagement process." Before Maxwell could respond, Lucy appeared with her tour group. "This would be a perfect time to explain our community advisory board model," she said, having clearly overheard the conversation. "Mr. Bennett, would you mind sharing how it helped shape our programs here?" Maxwell watched with pride as Lucy deftly facilitated a discussion between the developers and several community members who had gathered around. She had an instinctive understanding of how to bridge different perspectives, a skill born from her own experience of feeling voiceless and then finding her voice. The afternoon sun filled the mansion's restored library with warm light as Maxwell helped Mrs. Crawford sort through old photographs. They had been working on creating a historical display for the community center's upcoming educational program, but the task kept getting interrupted by memories. "Oh, look at this one." Mrs. Crawford held up a faded image of a young boy, proudly displaying a science fair project. "Your first experiment in this very room. You were determined to prove that plants could grow better with classical music." Maxwell chuckled, remembering his childhood certainty. "As I recall, the results were inconclusive, but it sparked my interest in how environments affect growth, though I lost sight of that lesson for a while." "But you remembered when it mattered most," Mrs. Crawford patted his hand. "And now look what's growing here." Through the library windows, they could see the afternoon activities in full swing. Lucy was conducting a peer tutoring session on the lawn, her students spread out on colorful blankets. Maria was giving a tour to representatives from another city interested in replicating their program. Sarah was reviewing plans with the construction team for the new wing that would house additional classrooms and a technology center. "Mr. Bennett!" Michael burst into the library, his face flushed with excitement. "Look what we found in the old garden shed!" He carefully placed a dusty wooden box on the table. Inside was a collection of garden tools, each handle worn smooth with age and marked with initials. "Those belong to the original gardener, Mrs. Crawford explained. He taught all the neighborhood children about plants and nature, including a certain young boy who used to sneak vegetables from the kitchen garden. Maxwell examined the tools with reverence, memories of summer afternoons. "Flooding back. We should clean these up, make them part of the display. They're part of the mansion's story too." "Everything here tells a story," Lucy said, joining them after her tutoring session. "That's what I love about this place. Every room, every object, has meaning." Sarah entered with fresh news from the city council meeting. They've officially designated the entire block as a historic community development zone. No more worries about future demolition threats. The announcement brought smiles of relief, but Maxwell noticed Mrs. Crawford's thoughtful expression. "What is it, Ellen?" "I was just thinking about cycles," she said softly. "How things come full circle. This mansion was built as a home, became a symbol of progress gone wrong, and now it's a home again. Not just for one family, but for an entire community." Maria joined them, adding another folder to the growing collection of historical documents. "We found something interesting. In the city archives," she reported, "the original owner of the mansion had included a letter with the building plans. Listen to this," she read from a yellowed page. "It is my hope that this house will stand not just as a shelter for my family, but as a beacon of possibility for the community. May its doors always be open to those who seek knowledge, comfort, and the chance to grow." "Sounds like we're finally fulfilling the original vision," Lucy observed, running her hand along the polished wood of a bookshelf. A commotion outside drew them to the windows again. The after-school art program was setting up for their first public exhibition. Children's paintings and sculptures filled the garden, each piece accompanied by a story about what had inspired it. "Speaking of vision," Sarah interjected, "the Foundation Board approved the expansion of our scholarship program. Starting next semester, we'll be able to support college education for 50 more students from the community." Maxwell watched as families began arriving for the art show, greeted by proud young artists eager to explain their work. Michael was carefully adjusting the lighting for his display, a series of photographs documenting the mansion's transformation. "Over the past year, you've created something remarkable here," Thompson's voice came from the doorway. He had returned for a follow-up meeting about the Oakland project. "Something that goes beyond real estate or community development. You've created a model for sustainable change." But Maxwell shook his head. "We didn't create this, we just removed the obstacles that were preventing it from happening naturally. Communities know what they need to thrive. Our job is to listen and support, not dictate and control." Mrs. Crawford smiled at this, reaching for one more photograph from the box. It showed the mansion in its early days, surrounded by a community gathering. Children playing, adults chatting, a scene not so different from what was happening outside their windows right now. "The heart of a home isn't in its walls," she said, placing the photograph carefully in the display. "It's in the lives it touches, the dreams it nurtures, the connections it enables. That's the true measure of progress." The autumn leaves danced across the mansion's front yard as Maxwell stood at his office window, watching a unique scene unfold. A group of real estate developers, wearing hard hats and taking notes, was being led on a tour by an unlikely pair of guides, Lucy and Michael. "The structural integrity of a community," Lucy was explaining, gesturing to the restored facade, "is just as important as the structural integrity of its buildings. You have to understand both to create meaningful development." Michael nodded enthusiastically beside her, adding, "Like our science garden project showed, healthy growth needs the right foundation. It's all connected." Sarah appeared at Maxwell's door with the latest quarterly reports. "They've been at it for 2 hours," she commented, nodding toward the tour group. Lucy's idea to have youth leaders conduct these educational tours is proving incredibly effective. She understands something I didn't for a long time, Maxwell replied, that the best way to change minds is to open hearts first. The Foundation's influence had grown beyond anything they'd initially imagined. What had started as a single preserved mansion had sparked a movement in urban development circles. Developers from across the country were coming to learn about their community-centered approach. Maria entered the office, her tablet displaying a series of emails. "The Oakland project is exceeding expectations," she reported. "The community advisory board model we helped Thompson implement has completely transformed their approach. They're even hiring local residents as project consultants." Through the window, they could see Mrs. Crawford in her favorite spot in the garden, surrounded by a group of elderly residents from the neighborhood. She had started a storytelling circle that was becoming the heart of an oral history project, preserving the community's memories for future generations. "We've received another interesting proposal," Sarah said, pulling up a document on her tablet. "The city wants to establish a training institute here, a place where other communities can learn to implement similar programs." Maxwell was about to respond when a commotion near the gate caught his attention. A familiar face was approaching. Richard Sterling, recently released from detention, looking considerably humbled in casual clothes. Lucy spotted him first, her body tensing slightly. But instead of retreating, she straightened her shoulders and continued her presentation, her voice clear and confident. "And this is where we learned our most important lesson about the true meaning of progress." Richard stopped at the edge of the group, listening silently. Maxwell watched as his former partner's expression shifted from discomfort to something that looked like recognition. Maria moved to stand beside Maxwell at the window. "Should we ask him to leave?" But before Maxwell could answer, Mrs. Crawford's voice carried across the garden. "Young man," she called to Richard, "would you like to join us? We're sharing stories about second chances." The moment hung in the air like a delicate thread. Then, slowly, Richard walked over to the storytelling circle. Maxwell couldn't hear what was said, but he watched as Mrs. Crawford patted the bench beside her, making space. "She never loses faith in people's capacity to change," Maria observed, softly, even after everything. Lucy's tour group had moved to the science garden, where Michael was demonstrating their latest experiments in sustainable urban farming. The developers, who had arrived with skeptical expressions and designer suits, were now eagerly examining composting systems and asking questions about community engagement strategies. "Mr. Bennett?" Sarah's voice brought him back to the matters at hand. "About the Training Institute proposal." Maxwell smiled, an idea forming. "What if we expanded it beyond just community development? What if we created a center for transformative practices, bringing together all the elements we've discovered work here?" Maria caught on immediately. The job training programs, the youth leadership initiatives, the elder wisdom projects, they're all part of the same story. "A story about remembering what matters," Maxwell added, watching as Richard listened intently to whatever tale Mrs. Crawford was sharing. "And having the courage to change when we've forgotten." Through the window, they could see Lucy concluding her tour. The developers were gathering around her, asking questions and taking photos of the community spaces. Michael stood proudly beside her, adding his own insights about how the center had changed his life. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "when I stopped that demolition, none of us could have imagined this outcome. We were thinking in terms of saving a building. But we ended up saving each other," Maria finished, watching her daughter with pride. As evening approached, the mansion took on a warm glow from within. The day's activities were winding down, but a special gathering was just beginning in the restored formal parlor. Community members of all ages filled the space, drawn by word that something unique was about to happen. Richard Sterling sat nervously at the edge of the group, his usual confidence nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Crawford had invited him to join their weekly community dialogue session, where residents shared their stories and discussed their hopes for the future. "Perhaps," she had suggested gently, "you have something to contribute to our understanding." Lucy sat across the room, her arms crossed, but her expression thoughtful. Maria stood nearby, ready to intervene if needed, but Mrs. Crawford had insisted on giving everyone space to find their own way forward. "We've been talking about transformation," Mrs. Crawford began, her voice carrying the wisdom of years. "About how change happens, not just in buildings or neighborhoods, but in hearts and minds." Maxwell watched from the doorway as Richard shifted uncomfortably. The man who had once orchestrated the displacement of entire communities now looked lost in this intimate gathering. "Would you like to share your perspective?" Mrs. Crawford asked Richard, her tone free of judgment. "We're all learning here." Richard cleared his throat, looking around the room at faces that had every right to reject his presence. I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began hesitantly. "About progress, about success, about what those words really mean." Michael, sitting near Lucy, leaned forward with unexpected interest. "Did you think you were helping people?" he asked suddenly. "When you were changing neighborhoods?" The direct question from a child seemed to catch Richard off guard. "I thought I was creating something better," he admitted. "But I was wrong about what better means." Lucy uncrossed her arms slowly. "Better for who?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "For profit margins," Richard answered honestly. "For shareholders. For people like me who never had to see the real consequences of our decisions." He paused, looking around the room. "But sitting here, seeing what you've created, this is what better actually looks like." The tension in the room began to shift, not toward forgiveness exactly, but toward understanding. Maria stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. "Understanding the harm we've caused is the first step," she said. "But what matters is what we do with that understanding." Mrs. Crawford nodded approvingly. "Which brings us to tonight's real purpose. Richard has approached the foundation with a proposal." All eyes turned to Richard as he pulled out a folder of documents. "During my time away, I had access to detailed records of all our development projects. Every community we targeted, every family we displaced. I want to use that information to help make things right." Maxwell moved into the room now, joining the circle. "We've been discussing how to expand our community restoration efforts," he explained. "Richard's information could help us identify the communities most in need of support." "And you trust him?" Lucy asked directly, looking at Maxwell. "Trust has to start somewhere," Mrs. Crawford interjected. "Just like healing does." Michael raised his hand, his face serious. "In our science experiments, we learned that sometimes things have to break down completely before they can grow into something new, like our compost." A ripple of laughter broke through the tension, and even Richard managed a small smile. "The boy has a point," Maria acknowledged. "Sometimes transformation requires complete deconstruction first." As the discussion continued, Maxwell observed the subtle shifts happening in the room. Lucy began asking Richard detailed questions about specific communities that had been affected. Maria pulled out her tablet to start mapping potential restoration projects. Michael eagerly shared ideas about how their youth programs could help other neighborhoods. Mrs. Crawford watched it all with satisfied eyes, occasionally adding her own wisdom to the conversation. The mansion's walls, which had witnessed so many changes over the years, now held space for this unexpected moment of reconciliation. Outside, the evening light painted the autumn trees in gold, and the sound of children playing in the garden filtered through the windows. The mansion, once almost lost to profit-driven progress, had become not just a community center, but a center for community healing. "You know," Richard said quietly to Maxwell as the meeting wound down, "I used to think power meant being able to change skylines, but real power is being able to change lives, including your own." Maxwell nodded, watching as Lucy showed Michael how to document the meeting's outcomes in the center's community journal. "The hardest changes," he replied, "are the ones that start in here." He tapped his chest right over his heart. The winter morning brought a dusting of snow to the mansion's grounds as Maxwell reviewed the expansion plans in the community room. Maps and documents covered the large table, each representing a neighborhood identified through Richard's records as a potential site for restoration. "The Oakland project is already showing impressive results," Sarah reported, highlighting specific data points. Thompson's team has fully embraced our community-first approach. They've even started their own youth advisory board, modeled after Lucy's program. Lucy, who had just entered with a stack of folders, beamed with pride. Michael's going there next week to help train their young leaders. Can you believe it? The same kid who barely spoke 6 months ago is now teaching others how to make their voices heard. Maxwell smiled, remembering the shy boy who had arrived clutching his mother's hand. Now Michael was becoming a leader in his own right, carrying the lessons they'd learned here to other communities. Mrs. Crawford wants to be involved in the expansion too, Maria added, joining them at the table. She's been working on a guide for establishing elder wisdom councils in each new community center. She says every neighborhood has its own storytellers. They just need a place to share their stories. The sound of excited voices drew their attention to the windows. A group of visitors was arriving, community leaders from various cities, come to learn about their model of transformative development. Among them, Maxwell recognized several faces from his old business world, developers who had once competed to build the highest towers and most luxurious malls. "Remember when they called us dreamers?" Sarah mused, watching the group approach. "Now they're calling us pioneers." Richard, who had been quietly working in a corner, looked up from his documents. "We were wrong about so many things," he said, softly. "The true value of a community can't be measured in square footage or property values." "No," Maxwell agreed. "It's measured in moments like these." He gestured toward the garden where, despite the cold, children were tending to the winter vegetables they had planted under Michael's guidance. Each bed was marked with a sign explaining its purpose, some for food, others for science experiments, and a special section dedicated to Mrs. Crawford's beloved flowers. Lucy gathered her materials, preparing to lead the visitors on one of her famous tours. "Should I tell them about the incident with the compost explosion?" she asked with a grin. "It really shows how failure can lead to better understanding." "Tell them everything," Maxwell encouraged. "The real story isn't about perfect solutions, it's about learning and growing together." Maria's tablet chimed with a notification. "The City Council approved our proposal for the Training Institute," she announced. "They're calling it the Center for Community Transformation. We can start development next month." The news brought smiles all around. The institute would be built on the land adjacent to the mansion, creating a campus dedicated to teaching other communities how to implement similar programs. But more than that, it would stand as a testament to the power of changing perspectives. "I've been thinking," Richard spoke up, his voice carrying a new kind of confidence. Not the brash certainty of his developer days, but something more thoughtful. "What if we created a documentation project, recording not just what we're doing, but how it feels, what it means to the people involved?" Lucy's eyes lit up. "Like the stories Mrs. Crawford collects, but for the whole transformation process. We could get everyone to contribute, the children, the families, even the developers, who come to learn." "A living history," Maria nodded approvingly, "something future communities can learn from." Sarah was already making notes. "We could integrate it into the Training Institute's curriculum, real experiences, real voices, real change." Through the window, they could see the visitors gathering around Michael in the garden. He was explaining their latest experiment, using cold frames to extend the growing season. His enthusiasm was contagious, drawing even the most skeptical-looking developers into the discussion. "You know what Mrs. Crawford told me yesterday?" Maxwell said, watching the scene. "She said that when you plant a seed, you're not just growing a flower or a vegetable, you're growing hope. Every garden we start, every program we build, every life we touch, they're all seeds of change." The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted garden. In that moment, Maxwell could see the full circle of their journey, from the day a child's cry of protest had awakened his forgotten heart, to now, when that same spirit of caring and community was spreading like ripples in a pond. The afternoon, light filtered through the mansion's stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the gathered crowd in the main hall. It was a special day, the official groundbreaking ceremony for the Center for Community Transformation, but also a celebration of everything that had led to this moment. Mrs. Crawford sat in her place of honor near the podium, her eyes bright. with pride as she watched Lucy prepare to address the assemblage. The young girl who had once shouted in protest was now a poised young leader, ready to help shape the future of community development. "A year ago," Lucy began, her voice clear and confident, "I stood outside this mansion and accused someone of not having a heart." She paused, glancing at Maxwell with a smile. "I was wrong. Sometimes hearts just need awakening and communities just need someone to believe in their power to grow." The audience, a mix of local residents, city officials, and visiting developers, listened intently as Lucy described their journey. Michael stood nearby, ready with his presentation about the science of community growth, complete with charts comparing their successful programs to his beloved garden experiments. "The most important thing we've learned," Lucy continued, "is that real progress isn't about replacing the old with the new. It's about honoring what exists while creating space for what can be." Maria stepped up next, presenting the impact data they'd collected over the past year. Employment rates, educational achievements, community engagement metrics, all showing remarkable improvements. But it was the personal stories she shared that truly captured the audience's attention. "These numbers represent real lives," she emphasized. "Real changes, real hopes restored, real futures reclaimed." As Maria spoke, Maxwell noticed Richard sitting quietly in the back row. His former partner caught his eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, of understanding finally achieved. The documentation project Richard had proposed was already underway, recording stories of transformation from every perspective, including his own journey from destroyer to rebuilder. Sarah approached the podium with the architectural plans for the new training center. The design, developed with input from the entire community, represented a perfect blend of functionality and beauty. Gardens would connect the buildings, creating spaces for both learning and reflection. But the most important feature, Sarah explained, isn't visible in these drawings. It's the spirit of community that will fill these spaces, the same spirit that saved this mansion and transformed all of us in the process. Mrs. Crawford wheeled herself to the front, her presence commanding immediate attention. "When I first came to this mansion as a young woman," she began, her voice carrying years of wisdom, "I believed my role was simply to care for a building. But over time I learned that buildings are just vessels for something much more precious. The connections we make, the lives we touch, the hope we nurture." She gestured to the gathered crowd. "Look around you. Every person here is part of our story. The children who learned to grow food in our gardens, the parents who found new jobs through our training programs, the elders who share their wisdom in our storytelling circles, even the developers who come to learn a new way of thinking about progress." Maxwell stepped forward then, taking in the faces before him, faces that had become family in ways he never could have imagined a year ago. "When we start construction tomorrow," he said, "we're not just breaking ground for a new building. We're expanding the foundation of a movement that recognizes the true heart of community development." He turned to Lucy, who stood tall beside Michael. "Sometimes it takes a child's courage to remind us of what really matters. Sometimes it takes losing our way to find a better path." The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of colored light dancing across the room. Through the windows, they could see the garden where their journey had truly begun, where a frightened boy had learned to grow more than just plants, where an angry girl had found her voice, where an old woman's wisdom had helped heal wounded hearts. "As we move forward," Maxwell continued, "we carry with us every lesson, every story, every moment of transformation. The Center for Community Transformation isn't just a new project. It's a promise to remember that real progress begins and ends with people." Mrs. Crawford reached for Lucy's hand, then Michael's, creating a circle that others spontaneously joined, until the entire room was connected. "In the end," she said softly, but her voice carried to every corner, "we are all gardeners of hope, tending to the seeds of change in our own ways." Spring returned to the mansion grounds, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility. The construction of the Center for Community Transformation was well underway, its foundations rising beside the Victorian mansion like a physical manifestation of their journey. Maxwell stood in his office, watching as Lucy led a group of students from another city through their programs. These visits had become regular occurrences, with communities from across the country sending representatives to learn from their experience. The Oakland project just sent their first quarterly report, Sarah announced, entering with her tablet. Their community engagement metrics are even better than ours were at this stage. Lucy's youth leadership model is proving particularly effective. Speaking of Lucy, Maria joined them, her face glowing with maternal pride. She's been invited to speak at the National Urban Development Conference. They want to hear about our youth-led initiatives directly from the source. Through the EFE window, they could see Michael demonstrating the latest developments in their community garden program. The once shy boy had grown into a confident young educator. His passion for science now seamlessly blended with his commitment to community development. Remember when we thought success meant the height of our buildings? A familiar voice came from the doorway. Richard entered, carrying a thick folder of documents. The research team has identified 3 more communities that were impacted by our old development practices. The Foundation's Restoration Fund is ready to begin outreach. The Restoration Fund had been Richard's idea, a way to channel his knowledge of past harmful practices into healing and rebuilding. Each project began with listening to the community's stories, understanding the damage done, and working together to create new possibilities. Mrs. Crawford's voice carried up from the garden where she was conducting one of her beloved storytelling sessions. The circle around her included both long-time residents and visitors, all drawn into the web of community history she wove with her words. The Training Institute curriculum is nearly complete, Sarah reported, pulling up detailed plans on her screen. We've incorporated elements from every aspect of our journey, from community engagement strategies to practical skills development. Mrs. Crawford's oral history program is actually becoming one of our most requested components. Because people need more than just buildings and programs, Maxwell observed. They need connection, understanding, a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Lucy was returning with her tour group, but now they were accompanied by an unexpected visitor, Thompson, their former board member, who had undergone his own transformation through the Oakland project. "You have to see this," Thompson announced excitedly, pulling out his phone to show them photos. The Oakland Community Center, modeled after their mansion renovation, was thriving. Gardens bloomed where parking lots had been planned. Children played in spaces that had once been slated for luxury retail. But the most amazing part, Thompson continued, is what's happening beyond our project boundaries. Other developers in the area are starting to change their approaches. They're seeing that community-centered development isn't just ethically right, it's sustainable and profitable in ways we never imagined. Maria smiled, remembering the long journey from her days as a displaced worker to her current role as Community Impact Director. It's like what Mrs. Crawford always says, when you plant seeds of kindness, you harvest fields of hope. Through the window, they watched as Michael led his group to the new construction site. The Center for Community Transformation was taking shape, its design incorporating elements suggested by community members of all ages. Large windows would flood the spaces with natural light, while gardens and gathering areas would provide places for connection and growth. Lucy has some interesting ideas for the center's inaugural program, Sarah mentioned. She wants to create a mentorship network, connecting experienced communities with those just beginning their transformation journeys. From protest to progress, Maxwell mused, remembering the angry young girl who had challenged his conscience that fateful day. She's showing us all how to turn pain into purpose. Mrs. Crawford's storytelling circle had moved closer to the construction site, her voice carrying wisdom accumulated through decades of witnessing community life. Every brick in these walls, she was saying, represents a story of change, a moment of choice, a step toward healing. Richard, who had been quietly reviewing his documents, looked up with unexpected emotion in his eyes. "I used to think legacy was about leaving your mark on the skyline. Now I understand it's about the marks you leave on people's lives." The afternoon light caught the mansion's restored stained glass windows, sending patterns of color dancing across the new foundation, being laid next door. In that moment, Maxwell could see the perfect symmetry of their journey. How saving one historic home had led to reimagining the very meaning of community development. The summer evening cast long shadows across the mansion's grounds as final preparations were made for a special celebration. 1 year had passed since the groundbreaking of the Center for Community Transformation, and the community had gathered to mark not just the completion of construction, but the journey that had brought them all together. The mansion's gardens were in full bloom, Mrs. Crawford's roses creating a fragrant backdrop for the festivities. String lights twinkled in the trees, and tables laden with food prepared by the culinary training program participants dotted the lawn. "Everything's ready for the presentation," Lucy told Maxwell, her clipboard clutched professionally to her chest. At 16, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had found her true calling. Michael's got the visual aids set, up in the new multimedia room. Michael, now a poised young teenager, was orchestrating a group of younger children in a special performance they had prepared. They would tell the story of their community's transformation through a combination of music, science demonstrations, and personal narratives. "The documentary team just finished the final edit," Sarah added, approaching with her tablet. The documentation project that Richard had proposed had evolved into a powerful film about community renewal, featuring stories from both their neighborhood and the growing network of transformed communities. Maria emerged from the news center, where she had been conducting last-minute checks. "The first training cohort arrives next week," she reported. "We've got representatives coming from 15 different cities, all eager to learn our approach." Mrs. Crawford held court near the Rose Garden, surrounded by both old friends and new visitors. Her storytelling circle had become a model for other communities, showing how preserving neighborhood histories could strengthen present-day connections. "I remember when this was all just a dream," Thompson said, joining the group. The Oakland project had exceeded all expectations, and he had become one of their strongest advocates in the development world. "Now look at what you've created." Richard stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, taking in the scene. His journey from corporate raider to community rebuilder had become part of the Foundation's teaching curriculum, a powerful example of personal transformation. "It's time," Sarah announced softly. Maxwell took his place at the podium, looking out over the assembled crowd. Faces familiar and new looked back at him. Community members, business leaders, government officials, and most importantly, the children who represented their future. "A year ago," he began, "we broke ground on a building. But what we were really breaking ground on was a new way of thinking about community, about progress, about what really matters in the work of development." Lucy stepped forward then, her voice strong and clear. "We learned that true transformation isn't about tearing down and replacing. It's about honoring what exists while creating space for what can be." Michael followed, gesturing to his beloved garden. "It's like our experiments taught us. Growth needs both strong roots and room to reach for the sky." Maria spoke next, her presence commanding respect. "We discovered that when you invest in people's potential, the returns go far beyond any traditional measure of success." One by one, community members shared their stories. The elderly resident who had found new purpose leading history walks, the young mother who had launched a successful catering business through the training program, the teenager who had discovered a passion for sustainable architecture. Mrs. Crawford wheeled herself to the front, her eyes bright with emotion. "In all my years watching over this mansion, I never imagined it would become such a powerful force for good. But then again, I always knew that buildings are just vessels for the real work of community, bringing people together, nurturing dreams, healing hearts." The documentary began playing on a large screen set up in the garden, showing images of their journey. The day of the attempted demolition, the first community meetings, the gradual transformation of both spaces and lives. The audience watched in rapt attention as their story unfolded. Richard stepped forward during a quiet moment. "I spent years believing that progress meant replacing the old with the new, that success could be measured in profit margins. I was wrong. Real progress is measured in the stories we're witnessing tonight, in renewed hope, in restored dignity, in reconnected communities. As the evening drew to a close, Maxwell found himself back in the mansion's kitchen, where it had all begun with Mrs. Crawford's cookies and afternoon stories. Lucy was there, teaching a group of visiting youth leaders her famous community engagement techniques. Michael was explaining his latest garden experiments to a group of developers who looked genuinely fascinated. "Full circle," Mrs. Crawford said softly, joining him at the window. "But circles don't end, do they? They just keep growing, reaching out, embracing more and more lives." A gentle autumn breeze rustled through the mansion's gardens as Maxwell watched the first class of the Community Transformation Institute receive their certificates. The ceremony was being held in the new amphitheater where the old carriage house had once stood. Representatives from 15 different cities sat among proud family members and community supporters. Lucy stood at the podium, her poise remarkable as she addressed the graduating class. "You came here to learn about community development," she said, "but what you're leaving with is something much more precious. The understanding that every neighborhood has its own heart, its own story, its own potential waiting to bloom." Michael, who had become an integral part of the training program, demonstrated their latest innovation, a mobile app that helped communities track both quantitative and qualitative measures of neighborhood well-being. "Because progress isn't just about numbers," he explained. "It's about how people feel about their home, their future, their place in the community." Sarah approached Maxwell with the latest impact report. "The ripple effects are extraordinary," she said quietly. "The first wave of communities implementing our model is showing remarkable results. Employment rates up, youth engagement increasing, elderly isolation decreasing. And something else that can't be measured," Maria added, joining them, "a sense of hope, of possibility, of belonging." Through the amphitheater's open design, they could see Mrs. Crawford in her beloved rose garden, surrounded by visiting community leaders eager to learn her secrets of storytelling and community building. Despite her advancing years, her spirit remained as vibrant as her flowers. "The Oakland Project has become a case study for urban renewal," Thompson reported, his tablet displaying impressive before and after images. 3 more cities have already adopted their modified version of the model. Richard, who had found his own path to redemption through documenting and addressing past wrongs, was quietly sharing his experiences with a group of developers. "The hardest part," they heard him say, "is admitting that what you thought was progress was actually causing harm. But that admission is where real transformation begins." The ceremony continued as each graduate shared their vision for their home communities. A woman from Detroit spoke about converting abandoned factories into community art spaces. A young man from Atlanta described plans for intergenerational learning centers. A team from Portland presented their strategy for preserving cultural heritage while addressing housing needs. Lucy beamed with pride as Michael demonstrated the sustainable garden techniques they had developed. What had started as simple science, experiments had evolved into a comprehensive approach to urban agriculture, now being implemented in communities across the country. "Remember," Mrs. Crawford's voice carried across the garden as she addressed her group, "buildings can be restored, programs can be implemented, but the real work is in restoring people's belief in themselves and their community." Maxwell watched as the graduates mingled with current residents, sharing stories and dreams. The mansion, once almost lost to profit-driven development, had become a beacon of hope, a living laboratory for a new kind of progress. Maria's tablet chimed with an incoming message. "The United Nations Development Program wants to study our model," she announced, her eyes wide with surprise. "They're interested in adapting it for communities in developing countries." "From one child's protest to international recognition," Sarah mused, remembering the day that had changed everything. "Who would have thought?" Lucy overheard and joined. To them, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "Actually, I did," she said with a grin. "The day Mr. Bennett stopped the demolition, I knew something important was happening. I just didn't know how important." The afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the gathering. In the new building's reflection, pool, the old mansion's image shimmered beside its modern companion, past and present in perfect harmony. "We're receiving applications from 30 more communities for the next training cycle," Sarah reported, "and that's not counting the international inquiries." Maxwell watched as Michael led a group of graduates through the garden, explaining how their composting system had evolved into a model for community waste management and sustainable agriculture. The boy's natural teaching ability reminded him of Mrs. Crawford's patient lessons in this same garden so many years ago. "You know what the best part is," Lucy said, watching the scene. "Every person here will go home and plant new seeds of change, and those seeds will grow and spread and create their own gardens of possibility." Mrs. Crawford wheeled herself over, her eyes twinkling. "Just like my roses," she said. "Each bloom carries the promise of many more to come." The winter sun cast long shadows through the mansion's restored windows as Maxwell helped Mrs. Crawford arrange photographs for the community center's expanding historical collection. Each image told a story of transformation, not just of buildings and spaces, but of hearts and minds. "Do you remember this one?" Mrs. Crawford held up a faded photograph of a young boy proudly displaying a science project. "Your first experiment in the garden. You were so certain that talking to plants would make them grow better." Maxwell chuckled, taking the photo. "And now Michael's proving it with actual scientific data. Some dreams just need time to find their proof." Lucy entered the room carrying a tablet with the latest community impact statistics. At 17, she had grown into her role as youth program director with remarkable grace. "The new satellite centers are showing amazing results," she reported. "Every community is adapting our model in unique ways, but the core principle remains the same. People first, always." Through the window, they could see Maria conducting a training session in the garden. Despite the winter chill, participants from around the world listened intently as she explained how their community engagement strategies had evolved from crisis to triumph. "It's remarkable," Sarah said, joining them with her ever-present tablet. "The United Nations report just came in. They're calling our model a paradigm shift in urban development. Communities from 5 continents are requesting guidance on implementation." Richard appeared in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "The last of the restoration projects is underway," he announced quietly. "Every community impacted by our old development practices has been contacted, heard, and offered support for renewal." Mrs. Crawford smiled warmly. "Healing takes time," she said, "but it always begins with acknowledging the wound and choosing to make things right." The sound of children's laughter drew their attention outside, where Michael was conducting a winter science program. The greenhouse he had designed with the community's input was full of life, proving that growth was possible in any season. "Mr. Bennett," a small voice called. A young girl, new to their after-school program, stood in the doorway. "Can you tell us the story again? About how one person's voice can change everything?" Maxwell glanced at Lucy, who grinned knowingly. The story of her protest had become legend among the children, a reminder that courage comes in all sizes. "Actually," he said, "I think we need multiple voices for this story. Mrs. Crawford, would you start us off?" As the children gathered around, Mrs. Crawford began weaving the tale of transformation. She spoke of a mansion filled with memories, of a community that refused to be erased, of a heart that remembered how to feel. Lucy joined in, describing the day she had found her voice and her purpose. Michael added the story of how science and community could grow together. Maria spoke of second chances and renewed purpose. Richard quietly shared his journey from destroyer to rebuilder. Thompson arrived as the story session was underway, carrying news of more cities adopting their approach. He paused in the doorway, listening as the narrative unfolded. "The most amazing part," Lucy told the children, "isn't that we saved this mansion. It's that in saving it, we found a way to save each other." Mrs. Crawford nodded approvingly. "Every brick in these walls," she said, "holds a lesson about what matters most in life. Not the height of our buildings, but the depth of our connections." The winter sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the stained glass windows. In the garden, despite the cold, Mrs. Crawford's roses continued to bloom, a testament to care, persistence, and the power of believing in possibility. Maxwell looked around the room at the faces that had become family. Lucy, who had awakened his conscience. Michael, who had shown how science could serve community. Maria, who had turned adversity into opportunity. Richard, who had found redemption in restoration. Mrs. Crawford, who had never lost faith in the power of love and memory. "You know," Mrs. Crawford said softly, "when I first came to this mansion as a young woman, I thought I was just going to tend a house. Instead, I learned that the most important things we can tend are the seeds of hope in each other's hearts." The children leaned in closer as she continued, "And those seeds, my dears, never stop growing. They just keep reaching out, touching more lives, creating more gardens of possibility." Through the window, they could see the lights of the Community Transformation Center coming on, a beacon in the gathering dusk. Within its walls, the next generation of community builders was being trained, carrying forward the lessons they had learned through trial and triumph. The spring sun rose over the mansion on a very special morning. 5 years had passed since the day a child's protest had changed the course of countless lives. The gardens were in full bloom, Mrs. Crawford's roses creating a fragrant arch over the path leading to the Community Transformation Center. Maxwell stood in his old office, now transformed into a community planning space, looking out over the grounds. The morning light illuminated a scene that would have been unimaginable half a decade ago. Where there had once been plans for luxury shops, there was now a thriving ecosystem of hope and possibility. "Are you ready?" Lucy's voice came from the doorway. At 18, she had just received her college acceptance letters, full scholarships to several prestigious universities, all interested in her pioneering work in youth-led community development. Everyone's gathering in the garden. The occasion was momentous. The 100th community to implement their transformation model was celebrating its successful first year. Representatives from around the world had come to share their stories and learn from each other. Michael, now a poised young man heading into his final year of high school, was conducting tours of the extensive gardens that had grown from his early experiments. Each community adapts the model to their own needs, he explained to visitors, but the core principles remain the same: listen, learn, grow together. Maria, who had become an internationally recognized expert in community engagement, watched proudly as her daughter prepared to address the gathering. The angry child who had once shouted at a developer had grown into a powerful voice for positive change. "Remember your first protest?" Mrs. Crawford teased Lucy gently as she wheeled herself into position for the ceremony. Despite her advancing years, her spirit remained as vibrant as her beloved roses. "You certainly knew how to get someone's attention," Lucy laughed, adjusting her presentation notes. "I was just saying what my heart felt. I didn't know it would wake up his heart too." Richard, who had found his own path to redemption through the Foundation's work, stood quietly at the edge of the gathering. The documentation project he had initiated had grown into a global resource for community transformation, helping others learn from both successes and mistakes. Sarah approached with the latest impact report displayed on her tablet. "The numbers are extraordinary," she said, "but they don't tell the whole story. It's the individual transformations that matter most." As if to emphasize her point, a group of children ran past, heading for the science garden where Michael had once discovered his purpose. They were followed by their parents, participants in the center's various training programs, each carrying their own story of renewal and hope. Thompson, now a leading advocate for community-centered development, joined them with news from the latest international conference. "Your model is being studied by urban planners worldwide," he reported. "They're calling it the heart-centered development approach." Mrs. Crawford smiled at this. Finally, they're using the right words. Development without heart is just construction. With heart, it's transformation. Maxwell took his place at the podium, looking out over the assembled crowd. Faces familiar and new looked back at him. Community leaders, international delegates, local residents, and most importantly, the children who represented the future they were all working to build. 5 years ago, he began, I stood on these grounds with very different plans in mind. I thought I knew what progress looked like. I thought I knew what success meant. I was wrong. Lucy stepped forward then, standing beside him. But being wrong became the first step toward being right, she added. Sometimes the heart needs a wake-up call to remember what it always knew. Michael joined them, gesturing to the flourishing gardens around them. We learned that real growth isn't about tearing down the old to build the new. It's about nurturing what's already there and creating space for what can be. Maria spoke next, her presence commanding respect. We discovered that every community has its own wisdom, its own strength, its own seeds of transformation waiting to bloom. Mrs. Crawford wheeled herself forward, her eyes bright with emotion. And most importantly, she said, we learned that no heart is ever truly lost. It just needs someone brave enough to remind it how to feel. As the ceremony continued, Maxwell watched the interaction of people from different communities, different countries, different backgrounds, all united by a common understanding that true progress begins and ends with the heart. The morning. Sun rose higher, casting its warm light over the gathered community. Mrs. Crawford's roses nodded in the spring breeze, their fragrance a reminder of how beauty and strength could grow from the most unexpected circumstances. You know what I've learned, Lucy said softly to Maxwell as they watched the celebrations. That one person's awakening can start a chain reaction of transformation, but it only works if we're brave enough to speak our truth and wise enough to listen when others speak theirs. Maxwell nodded, remembering the angry child who had shouted at him that day. And sometimes, he added, the bravest thing we can do is admit we were wrong and try to make things right. The sound of children's laughter floated up from the gardens where Michael was teaching a new generation about growth and possibility. In the community center, Maria was sharing strategies with visitors from around the world. And through it all, Mrs. Crawford's roses continued to bloom, a living testament to the power of nurturing what matters most. The heart always remembers, Mrs. Crawford said, watching the scene with satisfaction. It just needs a little reminder sometimes of what truly matters. And in that moment, surrounded by the community that had grown from a single act of protest, Maxwell understood that some developments couldn't be measured in square footage or profit margins. The most important developments happened in the heart, where true transformation began and where the seeds of change would continue to bloom for generations to come.